Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Washington County Public Affairs Forum on Monday, December 12th, 2016. We are engaged in an experiment, just so that you know. This is the first time we are attempting to be live on Facebook as we are doing this. And thanks to a wonderful volunteer, Monique Jones, sitting over here to my right. Yes, by all means. We have had an awful lot of wonderful volunteers. Monique will be helping us with social media over next year and actually probably over Christmas. She doesn't know that she isn't spending Christmas with friends and family. She's spending Christmas working on helping us with social media. Just thought I'd let her know that. We have been blessed as an organization that is an all-volunteer organization with wonderful volunteers. Many of you have been here regularly, know Chris Leslie, who is our greeter, a wonderful gentleman. He's been doing that job for the longest time, and he has been ill for the last several weeks. We hope he will be back on January 9th, and he spoke with me yesterday and asked me to say Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to all the regulars, so I am doing so, and happy to do so, because he's just one of the many wonderful volunteers we have. We had the pleasure of having a former president serve us as a paid executive director. Okay, kind of paid. We did the best we could for just a few hours a month. He did a marvelous job in that role, and he also has been helpful to us on a volunteer basis. He's done so much for us. I could tell you, but I did tell you in June when we, as a board, came up with a lifetime membership that only costs $500, or you could do exceptional volunteer work, and we may recognize you. Sadly, in June, when he came up here and made his speech at that time, so don't worry, we won't have to hear too much from him today, I have the opportunity, and I will take it, to present the certificate to Mr. Eric Squires. Would Eric come up, please?
Hi, folks. Ooh, fancy, fancy. Thanks, folks.
You know what's amazing? We're saving money without him, but working harder, but we managed to find the funds for a frame. I don't want to lose this opportunity to thank just a few other people. While Chris has been away, we have Jim helping us out. Jim, will you wait as far as greeting is concerned? And we also, yes, by all means, we also have wonderful volunteer work done by the gentleman who's finding us wonderful speakers, including the gentleman we'll hear from in just a few minutes. If Spencer would wave his hand, Spencer Airman, he's done a fantastic job. We have our treasurer who is keeping our funds and has not left town recently. Would Tim wave his hand? Thank you. And just before I introduce today's speaker, I really need to acknowledge one more board member who's here. Congresswoman Elizabeth First has brought not only class and talent to our board, but also dedication. Yes, class. And I think I can recognize that pretty well. Thank you so much. And we could not make this thing work. We wouldn't have sound. We have video most of the time. We would have none of that if it weren't for Joseph Tyner. Joseph is our sound guy.
Hey, Joseph!
As opposed to me, because I have been reminded that I'm usually our unsound guy, but we won't discuss mental health any further. And our secretary, who does the best notes I know, Phil Nelson, if you wave his hand, thank you. And thank you so much for being patient while we recognize folks who make this thing happen. This is our 61st year. We couldn't be here for 61 years if it weren't for the volunteers. So again, thank you very much. Now I move to a wonderful opportunity. I get to introduce today's speaker. Morgan Holm is with OPB, and he has a challenge today. He's representing the media across the United States to discuss the most pressing question that our maybe the election had more pressing questions after the results as to what's going to happen now, but there's a major focus on the media, and today we're going to learn where the media stands, where it can go. Ladies and gentlemen, Morgan Holm from OPB. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Thanks to all of you for giving me a chance to be here today to talk to you. I'm going to take on that challenge of representing all the media today. It's been a subject of quite a bit of discussion at OPB, but along the way there, I'm going to cover a little bit of history because I think that starting at the beginning is important because where you've been has a lot to do with where you head, and that's particularly true of OPB. So we'll spend just a few minutes going back into the past, and as we kind of make our way forward, some of the technology changes that OPB is experiencing have driven some changes in the way we do our work as a media organization, and those are broadly reflective of the trends nationally, even internationally in media. And some of that contributes directly to where we are today in December 2016 with the role of the media in society. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Just this last week, actually, a rather significant date passed. It was December 7th. It is a day that lives in infamy, let's be honest about that. But for about 19 years before it was a date that lived in infamy, it was the date that OPB actually started its existence. And way back in 1922 on the campus of Oregon State University, in fact, this is a picture of a guy, it's a little hard to see, but there's a man holding a microphone right in the center of that picture. That was physics professor Jacob Jordan. He built the first transmitter down in Corvallis at what was then KFDJ-AM. He started out as, it was an academic program to teach people how to build and use radios. And so in order to do that, they had to have a station on the air to do something with it. And that's how OPB got started. And it wasn't too much after that that the call letters got changed to reflect the school's name at the time, which was the Oregon Agricultural College. And that's why it's KOAC-AM, even today at 5:50 a.m. in the Willamette Valley. So that was the beginning. In fact, that building is still there. If you drive along the old highway north of Corvallis, you can still see that facility. And there are engineers there. If you stop by and ask nicely, they'd show you around a little bit. There's some interesting little features to that building. It's kind of a fun place to see the history of OPB. Dug this out of the archives because I thought it said something important about OPB in its early days. Again, a little hard to read maybe, but it said, if you're interested in your home, farm, school, and state, then you're interested in Oregon's own station. So even in those early days, OPB really had a commitment to local service. The job early on was to tell farmers what they needed to know in terms of crop information, weather information, market information. They used to do broadcasts of different classes at OSU. The Glee Club would perform live over the air, a lot of home economics programs to help people understand what to do. That was the fundamental part of the service. But then as we got a little bit further along, a rather big development happened in media. TV came along in the 50s, and that was a game changer for OPB and for a lot of other media as well. KOAC started doing television from a studio in the basement of Gill Coliseum, and that's another place on the historical tour of OPB sites you can still see in the basement of Gill, a building that has not changed in decades. They would produce programs like Oregon at Work and Choo Choo Charlie. This photo is actually a photo of Choo Choo Charlie. That encouraged young viewers at home to color in coloring books that the station would distribute. So it was early interactive media and kids programming, some of the same things we do today. And a lot of programming that was basically public affairs kinds of programming. So they would talk to legislators, they talk to the governor of the day. We have some film around of a Robert Kennedy visit to Oregon State University. And so that was really a lot of what KOAC was doing at that point. And, OPB, I think, kind of took on that new form of media and managed to survive pretty well. And then, wouldn't you know, another new kind of media came along. This one's a lot harder to have a picture of, right? But the internet is out there. We know what it is. It's a gigantic network of computers and information. It started out, of course, as a defense project and then an academic project in the 1960s and 70s. But today, people pretty much take for granted that they can share information on websites. We can be on Facebook Live. All of that, of course, is attributable to the internet. And for OPB, our first website actually went live beginning in 1994. So we've been live on the internet for a number of years now. And that's changed how we work quite a bit, because in the old days, we knew how to do radio programs, we learned how to do television programs, and now we're learning how to share news with people on the internet. But just when we thought we were getting the hang of that, something else came along. Started out as Facebook, social media, but it rapidly became clear that there was more to social media than just Facebook. We have to be present or at least aware of a whole host of social media sites. And you may know, for example, Facebook is one of the largest countries, if you will, in the world, with the number of people who are signed up to it and use it on a daily basis. So if you're a media organization, you have to think about what you're doing on Facebook. You have to have a presence on Twitter. You have to be connected with people on LinkedIn. You just can't operate in today's world without having a foot there in some way. But as we've kind of done this, I've seen an interesting thing happen to our audience. I actually started at OPB in 1990, a relative newcomer there. During that time, OPB's audiences on radio and television and the internet have grown. And what we see now is that our internet audience is about on par with our radio audience, and some months a lot bigger. So for example, in the Portland area, we have an audience for radio of about 350,000 people a week. That's a pretty healthy audience for radio. A weekly audience for our website actually can range anywhere from 200,000 to 800,000 people. So it's not insignificant. We figure on a monthly basis between radio listeners, TV viewers, and internet users, something more than 1 million people come into contact with OPB on a monthly basis. So that's a healthy and I think respectable audience for us. But it has made us think about where things will go in the future. So there are people out there who say that the era of broadcasting is over, that the towers are going to come down. I'm not sure I'm there yet, quite honestly. There are a lot of people who still use radio and who still watch television. In fact, some surveys of media use show that something between 90 and 93% of Americans still listen to a radio at least once a week. Now, they may do it differently than they did in the past. A lot of people used to jump in the car, turn on the radio as they were driving. That was easily the most popular place to hear the radio. But not so much anymore. We have thousands of people each week who listen to the radio over the internet, right? They're streaming audio, so that's become much more common. How about television? It's true, fewer people actually sit down in the evening and watch broadcast television. Those audiences have declined. A lot of people watch Netflix or Hulu or Amazon or something like that. But at the end of the day, they're still watching television. They're still watching shows that are dramatic or funny or something like that. It's just how it's delivered to them has changed. And the fact of the matter is, there are still a lot of people who sit down and watch a television show. There are a lot of people sit down and watch Oregon Field Guide every week, or Oregon Heartbeat, or Nova, or something like that. So I'm not too terribly worried about that. In fact, I think we've taken a lot of time at OPB to think about what our future holds, and there are a lot of positive signs. So OPB is generally the #1 or #2 station in the Portland market. That's rare for a public radio station. But I think a testament to the fact that what we do is important to people. As I mentioned, we have a lot of people who also stream us online. Those are actually included in the radio ratings as well. We still have a very strong television presence. So shows like Oregon Field Guide and Oregon Heartbeat and Oregon Experience are actually among the most popular public television shows, not just in Oregon, but in the country. They're very, very popular, very strong programs. But one thing we haven't figured out is how those programs succeed in the era of Netflix and Amazon and things like that. We're still experimenting with, and I'll talk about in a moment, one of the ways we're doing that. We're experimenting with how to turn programs like that into things that Netflix viewers might be able to see and experience. PBS continues to do a lot of valuable programming, particularly for kids, so that's harkening back to our roots in public television. In fact, next month, PBS is launching a full-time, 24-hour-a-day kids channel that OPB will be carrying both over the air and on cable. So that's going to launch towards the end of January. But we think that'll be an excellent service for children. It'll bring back some of the PBS series that were popular in years past, and it'll be an opportunity to get more airtime for some of the current series. But it really meets a need that cable companies in the market are not otherwise meeting. So there's still a future there in television. And so I just got ahead of myself there. And of course, on the internet, we continue to see people finding us. So we had a relatively big story here in Oregon not too long ago when the wildlife refuge out in Malheur was occupied. And OPB was actually one of the main sources in the world for news about that. So in 1 month, we had nearly 1 million people who visited our website to learn about that. They were listening to stories, reading stories, watching videos, and things like that. So, so we play an important role in that way, and we intend to on an ongoing basis. But we are changing in a pretty important way, and this now does get back to that matter of transmitters. So for decades, I think in OPB's own mind, our job was to transmit information, right? To make sure the shows are going out over the airwaves, whether that's radio or television, and that was what we did. But we've changed the way we see ourselves in that regard, so that we're less about being a station that presents news and more about being a news organization that operates, among other things, radio stations, television stations, a website, and a social media presence. That might seem like a pretty subtle distinction, but it's actually a pretty huge change in mindset for us, because it makes it less about doing a radio story and more about doing a story that some people will hear on the radio, some people will read on the website, some people may see on a video. And from where I sit now, as the head of the newsroom and the other programming, it makes it less important for me to hire somebody who knows radio well, and more important for me to hire somebody who knows journalism well, who's a good writer. So we've hired people like Jeff Mapes from the Oregonian and Anna Griffin, who was an editor over there, neither of whom had ever worked at a broadcast facility, but we didn't hire them because they were great broadcasters, although we put them on the air a lot. They're pretty good, actually. We hired them because they're good at journalism. And that's increasingly the direction that we're going with the work that we do. That being said, we recognize that our future now depends on us being available and accessible on all those platforms, all those devices, whether you've got a smartphone or a tablet or a smart TV at home or whatever it is. We want to be sure that OPB is available and accessible to you there. So it's a different job than it was 30 years ago, quite honestly, 50 years ago, 70 years ago. But it's a pretty exciting one, and it's exciting in large part because people are still finding what we do. And from the content producer side, from the journalist side, it's opened up some amazing opportunities to tell stories in our community. So we've really started to take on these multimedia projects that allow us to explain a story from a lot of different perspectives. This is one that we did last spring. Jazz Month, National Jazz Month is in April, I learned. So we had a project called Jazztown that included a television documentary about the section in Portland that for a time after World War II became a real hub of the jazz world. Major jazz musicians coming through town. It was a large African American population that was there. It was a cultural center, and it disappeared almost as quickly as it developed due to what would have been a version of gentrification today. So we did a television show on that, but we also have in our building, KMHD, the jazz station that Mountain Community College owns. That's part of what we do. They had a whole month worth of programming around the history of jazz in Portland. We did additional online videos about how jazz music developed, where you could go to listen to jazz in Portland. We heard from a number of jazz musicians and players. So that whole month, we basically had a focus across our platforms on jazz in Portland. And we had a lot of fun with it, and it got a very wide reach, I think, as we stepped back and looked at it. But you have to have a television station and a radio station and a website and all of that to really have that kind of impact. OPB is one of the few organizations that has that kind of ability. We also have the ability to do that with shows like Oregon Field Guide. So this was a program we did earlier this year called Discovering Valhalla. This was an incredible story that came to us. If you saw the show, you might remember this. A guy who worked for the Forest Service was flying back to base during fire season, and they were flying low over this particular part of the wilderness area right around the Santiam Pass area. And he looked down and he saw what looked like a slot cannon, and he's like, that's funny, I don't remember seeing that on a map. And he went and he checked the maps, there's nothing there. And normally they wouldn't have even been able to fly that low because of the smoke. They were really not too far off the ground. So he kind of made it his mission to go back and figure out what that was. And it took him 2 or 3 attempts, but he finally got in there. And sure enough, he found this slot canyon. It's actually really not that far away from Highway 20, or the Santiam Pass Highway 20, I think, that runs over the mountain there. But he couldn't find anybody who had really hiked through there and documented it or described it. So we put together an expedition with his help, and we started at the top and went all the way through to the bottom, filming the whole thing. I think they tracked through about 11 different waterfalls in that area, and the crew we were with actually rappelled down most of those waterfalls with cameras. It's a very technical challenge. Some of the walls are really not that much further apart than one arm span. That's a place I'm never going to get there. I'm not that much of a hiker. But most people aren't, and actually the Forest Service would probably prefer that we not all flock there. But it was a fantastic way to show people a part of Oregon that's right there that many of us have never seen. Again, we had a television show. We were able to do a lot of video. It was actually a news story that had some national carriage. And so we had radio programming around it. We had an online component of it. And again, this was one where we did something interesting with it based on how we know people watch television. We aired the show about 9 or 10 times in the course of a week, and the audience actually got bigger every time. It was just phenomenal to be able to see this, and I think there are other great places in Oregon, and we're branching out a little bit into Washington, the name notwithstanding, there to show other great places like that. And just one last example that I'm quite proud of. We've been working on this project called the Class of 2025 for several years now. We actually started with a group of kids at Earl Boyles Elementary on the east side of Portland when they were in kindergarten. They're in 4th grade now. And we've just been following this class through school as they deal with issues that kids deal with, that families deal with. This is a school that's in an area with a lot of economic and ethnic diversity, so there's a lot of interesting challenges there. It's been a really interesting lens through which to see education policy. It's not the same thing as covering school funding in the legislature or the school board meeting. It's really seeing education through the eyes of kids, their parents, their teachers, and the school administrators. We have actually just hired our first full-time Spanish-speaking reporter to help us with this project, because about half of the kids that we're tracking speak Spanish at home, and we found we weren't able to do a good enough job understanding their experience and sharing that with them without somebody who could speak their language. So beginning this year, we'll be doing podcasts in Spanish and actually stories in Spanish that we'll share with local Spanish media and national Spanish media to help tell this story. So that's a new thing for OPB. It's a primarily radio and online project right now, but I hope that at some point we will have a television documentary that we'll do locally, and I think there will be sufficient interest to do it nationally. And we intend to follow them all the way through graduation, so it's quite an ambitious project, and I think it's really setting a great precedent for where we're going in the future. Boy, I jumped ahead there. So I want to talk now about something that might be on your mind. What the heck happened in November, and what does that mean for media? Well, from where I sit, I've probably read 1,000 articles about the impact of the election on media at this point, and I'm not exaggerating that. And there's a lot of debate about what the election results mean for media, what they mean for consumers, news consumers like you. And so I just offer a few quick observations that I hope will help. There's been much said about being in a post-truth or post-fact world. I disagree with that. I actually think that facts do matter, and that regular people still recognize a fact when they see one and still want to know the truth of a matter. So this is actually something that one of NPR's hosts wrote over the weekend. Steve Inskeep talked about being in a post-trust world. I think that might actually be closer to the truth. And it relates not just to media, but to institutions generally. The trust that people have in media, in government, in a variety of civic institutions has eroded for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to say that media didn't contribute to that. There's certainly a role, but it's not unique to the media. So trust is an issue that we have to keep dealing with, and one of the interesting things I'm seeing right at the moment is, you might have an administration that sort of demands that people trust it, but in our experience, you have to earn trust, and you earn it by what you do every single day. So for us as a media organization, we have to earn it with every story we do, every interview we do. You can't just go out there and say to people, hey, we're the media, trust us. Those days are over, if they ever existed. So we just have to take every story seriously and make sure that it says what's provable, that it contains facts, that it contains a degree of truth, if you will. And I think, we're going to be challenged with that, with issues. We've already had it. A good example of this is this whole alt-right thing that people have been talking about. I first saw that term and I was not familiar with it. I'm looking into it and I'm thinking, wow, I've seen this before. This is white supremacy, straight out. And so, I've kind of watched to see where things were going, and the discussion kind of verged over into, well, this is white nationalism, and I can kind of see where that's coming from. But I do think it's going to be up to us in the media to call that stuff out when we see it that way. I covered the civil trial some years ago of Tom Metzger, who was ultimately held responsible for inciting some skinheads to beat an Ethiopian man to death in southeast Portland. That was straight out white supremacy. And I see the same thing going on here. And I think it's a fair conclusion for people in the media to make, to say what we're seeing and what that matches up to. So it's going to take courage to do that. But I think we can do it, and we ought to do it when we get to that point. I think there's some degree of responsibility on you as consumers, though. There is a shocking lack of news literacy skills in the population today. I saw a survey last week done by Ipsos and BuzzFeed, just testing if people could make a distinction between sort of true news and fake news, right? And so they just read people a series of headlines, some of which weren't true and some of which were. And about 75% of people, regardless, felt like, oh yeah, that sounds realistic. That's chilling. It should be chilling. We all need to equip ourselves with ways to make that distinction between what's real and what's not. And that's something the internet, I think, has confused a little bit too, because if you look at some of those so-called fake news stories, they look just like the real thing. They have the same kind of presentation, the same format, but you don't have to scratch below the surface very far to see how different that is from a news organization that requires stories to be edited by one or two people, sometimes more, before it gets presented out there, where the reporters actually call the people involved in the story and do interviews, and then call people who disagree with the people in the story and do interviews. I mean, there's some fundamentals that even we in the media need to start helping people grasp so that we can sort out the difference between what's real and what isn't. This third one is, I think, a much more challenging one, which is, and this is a larger social trend. It's not just media consumption. The Pew Research Center has done some really interesting work on this, looking at how people are self-sorting in some ways. The way they live, their social circles, their media consumption tends to reinforce their worldview. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a free country, right? You can reinforce your worldview as much as you like. But as people have sort of created these bubbles around themselves, it has exposed them less to competing worldviews, things that they would disagree with. And I have to say, some of that you used to get in the newspaper, right? You get the newspaper, you'd read some stories that, like, yeah, I know what those guys at the city council are up to. And then you'd see another story and think, well, I had never heard about that. There was a degree of serendipity involved there. That serendipity is largely gone, and social media has not helped in that regard. So Google and Facebook have algorithms that determine what a person sees based on what they've shown interest in their traffic. So, if you're interested in stuff that you're interested in, their job is not to show you things that you disagree with. But that is our job in the media. So it's a challenge for us how to kind of get across that bubble. And I actually think that OPV is kind of uniquely positioned to do that, because we've been reaching a wide audience for a long time. I actually told our staff this a couple of days after the election. I said, look, we are a microcosm of the country because we have an audience in Portland that could be fairly described as this sort of liberal coastal elite. We also have a large audience through the rest of the state, not just in the Willamette Valley, but Eastern Oregon, many rural areas. And we have to work hard to make sure that audience is as well served as the Portland audience. So we're already practicing this. We just need to be more open about it, and maybe we need to set a good example for other people to see. We can't do it alone, and I think many media organizations need to think about how they're going to activate that by their example. And then that last one is, so this gets back to things in Facebook and Google. There are companies out there that are really good with the meme, with the headline that everybody shares. If you read a little bit about this Pizzagate thing, it's kind of an example of that. There was a story with no foundation in reality that spread like wildfire because of the way news spreads in the digital world. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could get actual investigative stories to spread that way, or real news? This is something that those of us who have been in the media business for decades are going to have to figure out. We're going to have to figure out how to meet social media audiences where they are and get the real news to spread as effectively as the fake stuff. Part of that is hiring the people who live there. We're changing our workforce, we're changing our approach, but we have to do that while kind of keeping the DNA of news gathering central to what we do. So we've got some big challenges ahead of us. I'm going to take your questions in a moment on that, but I'll give you a few observations. And just by way of concluding, OPB is, I think, we count on people like you. We have over 130,000 members today. We're proud of that. We've been recognized repeatedly as one of the outstanding stations in the region and the country. So thank you for making that possible, and we look forward to continue doing some interesting things as we go in the future. So, what's on your minds?
Thank you very much, Mr. Holm. I don't think we're going to have to wait too long for questions. I have one, but I think I'll wait till the end. Thank you very much. Our first questioner.
Eric Squires, former member. First, thanks for being here. Great presentation, good overview of the organization. I'm curious if you could share with me the structure of the editorial process in your organization. What would be really helpful is if you could tell me size and scope, like number of people, policies and procedures, because you seem to posture as a nonprofit, private or corporation. But what do you do in order to eliminate the bias?
That's a great question. I wish more people would ask that question of every organization. So our editorial structure, I'm the chief content officer, so I'm essentially the chief editor. We basically have several different units that each are responsible for their editorial groups. So the biggest one is the newsroom. So there's an executive editor of news who reports to me. She oversees the daily newsroom, our talk show, Think Out Loud, and as it happens, our art show, State of Wonder. In the newsroom, there's a news director who's responsible for the daily management of all of our field reporters. So that's Anna Griffin, actually, from the Oregonian. So Anna is assigning all the main stories. And in addition to Anna, there are 3 other editors who work, kind of staggered shifts 7 days a week to catch breaking news and things like that. Every story that OPB puts out on the air from one of our reporters is edited by one or more of those folks. So whether it's a very short 40-second story at the top of the hour newscast or a longer 7 or 8 minute story, whether it's a podcast that we do in Politics Now, there's always another set of eyes and ears looking at that, questioning that, asking, what's your basis for saying that, or have you talked to this other person? That's our routine in that regard. And on the talk show, it's a little different because you can't pre-edit all of those things, but we have 5 producers that work on that and an executive producer. They do pre-interview most of the guests on there, so we have some sense of what people are going to say on the show. And Dave Miller is just a great host. He's in constant communication with a little online deal. So the executive producer and that day's show director are listening to the show while Dave is doing it and communicating with him about things. If you've ever hosted a radio show, not everybody has, you have got a lot of stuff coming at you and you're trying to balance this. It's very helpful to have another person kind of able to say, did you hear what that person just said? Don't forget to ask them about that. So we have some checks and balances that way. When you get over to the television shows, Art Beat, Field Guide, Oregon Experience, there's an executive producer for each of those. They act as the chief editor for each of those shows, so every script that comes through there is developed by the individual producer and then checked by the executive producer. There's also a head of television production, Dave Davis, and he watches the vast majority of those. I mean, I suppose there's probably a few that he doesn't get to, but there are at least 2 sets of eyes, again, kind of watching each of those television programs before they go out. Then we have a digital staff of 7 people, and they basically co-edit. Again, we've got about 2 people on most of the time, watching the website all day, every day, watching social media. Whenever they write something, or if they're taking a story that one of our reporters has done and preparing it for online, there's always a second set of eyes. Somebody will write it up and say, hey, Dave, can you look at that? Or Brian, can you look at that? And so again, we just, that's our way of operating, is that nothing leaves the building without a second set of eyes. With the exception, I will say, of social media. So that's been, with Facebook posts, generally we can edit those before we post, but Twitter moves fast enough that you have to kind of count on individual journalists to be sensible and to tweet things that are verifiable. So sometimes we'll just take it a little bit slower. I tell people I'd rather be right than first, and that's just a mentality you have to accept. So that writ large is kind of the scale of our operation. There are a total of about 65 people in the content area. I'd say of that number, 10 to 12 are solely editorial, and another maybe 5 or 6 beyond that have at least a partial editorial role. So, thank you.
Phil Nelson, board member, I want to thank you for coming. And I was going to say this, Dave Miller is absolutely a phenomenal radio creature. He just does a great job, and I thought for quite a while he was a national figure, but apparently it's here locally.
I hope to keep him here, actually.
Well, it'd be hard to keep it. I'm one of these guys who turns on the radio in the car, and it seems that there's more and more advertising constantly coming over on the radio side anyway, and I'm wondering, is there an increase, have you been experiencing an increase in the need to have paid advertising, and is it going to keep going up so it takes up more time of the listening audience?
So that's a good question. I would say that what we call it in the radio business, the avails, or the amount of time that's devoted to that, really hasn't changed for OPB in a number of years. What has changed is the demand for it. So most months, most of those slots are full now. So they've always been there, they just haven't always been subscribed. So that's good, that's been good for business. But really, in terms of our overall operation, we don't have a desire to expand that on either radio or television, because the real secret sauce that I think we have is our members. That really does count, and I say this during pledge drives, but I say it because it's true. So in the high 60% of our operating funds is dependent on membership. And philosophically, that's what public broadcasting should be. It should not be advertiser supported, should not be government supported for that matter. We have about 8 or 9% of our funding comes from federal and state sources, and I doubt that it will ever go higher than that. So we're about where we're at. Some months you're going to hear a few fewer underwriting spots because they're not all sold, and some months you'll hear a few more because they're there. But we're not looking to expand that as an aspect of what's on the air there. So good question.
Well, this is kind of a follow-on. Virginia Bruce, forum member and publisher of the Cedar Mill News. Over the past 15, 20 years, we've seen privatization and more corporatization on the national level for public broadcasting. The Congress pulled back funding, put in a more corporate-friendly management on the national level.
Well,
and I guess my question is, are you feeling those pressures from national, and are you feeling those pressures in Oregon to become more corporate, more private?
Really, there hasn't been any change in Washington in how public broadcasting is funded or managed. The last sort of tricky part was actually in the mid-90s when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, and there was an attempt kind of to defund public broadcasting. But and that failed in large part because people in general, not Congress, but people stood up and said, we kind of like public broadcasting the way it is. To the extent that there have been changes, I would say there's a bit of a difference between radio and television, because television gets the lion's share of the federal funding by statutory requirement. This actually dates back to the original Public Broadcasting Act. But television production is far more expensive than radio and is far more difficult to fund these days. So in the old days, it used to be, you'd watch in a Masterpiece Theater or Nova, and you'd see like Exxon, or actually Mobil, so now it's Exxon Mobil, but this was before the merger, right? So Mobil would fund a whole season of that. They just write the check for it because that was a charitable contribution for them. Those days are gone. So it has become harder to find that kind of corporate and foundation support for that programming. That hasn't changed the way public broadcasting is managed or funded from the federal level, but I can see how you could read that as a change in the way, in the relationships with corporations, because that has changed in a very practical way. It has been a struggle to kind of sustain that level of corporate funding to add to what the federal funding for public broadcasting is $400-some million a year. It's not even a rounding error in the federal budget. It's almost nothing. But it's leverage to raise those other funds that we need for television production, things like that. It's just an expensive business to get into, and it's a very competitive business. So
well, I worry about prior restraint. We better not talk about this because our corporate funders wouldn't like it.
Yeah, don't worry too much about that. If they take their money and walk away, we'll find another way to do it, I think that's what independence means, right? Is you can't become too dependent on either a corporate support or frankly, federal or state support. And I think that's an important question in public broadcasting right at the moment. And again, this is a place where people look at OPB as a leader because we have a successful model with the number of members that we have that shows that it's possible. So, how do we translate that at the national level into other places? Many public television and radio stations are licensed to municipalities or to universities or to states, and that brings with it strings, honestly. And so there's some, of course, OPB used to be. I was a state employee when I first started working at OPB, but we separated from the state back in the early 90s. So, I think on the whole, that was a good thing for us. I'm not sure what the future holds for a lot of individual organizations that way, but I appreciate the concern, and I think you're right about that. So.
Good morning, I'm Patrick Freeler, Holm member, and also OPB member for 38 years. It's more of a comment than anything else. I'm a big fan of Science Friday, and you cut off an hour, second hour, it drives me crazy because I've got to go on the internet to pick up the second hour out of WNED in Washington, D.C.
You're not the only person who feels that way. It's true. It was that's the dilemma of the radio programmer. What we saw over the years was that the number of people who were staying for that second hour was dropping off considerably. You are a more loyal fan than most, and we felt in the long run it would be better to have Think Out Loud on all 5 days a week, because as much as radio is about shows, really audiences listen to a format. I mean, they actually don't oftentimes tune in just to hear Science Friday, or for that matter, Think Out Loud or anything else. They turn on the radio and if they tune to OPB, they expect to hear news or something like that. So I wish there was a perfect solution where we could put all of those things on. But with the way people can stream programs now, you can obviously tune to another station and get that. We try to serve the greatest number of people that we can at any given hour, and sometimes that means making a tough decision about what program to keep in that slot and which one not to. But duly noted, it's we assess that on an ongoing basis, and we may reassess that at some point. So it's good to hear from people who are interested in that. I appreciate that.
My name is Bill Kroger. I'm a forum member, and thanks for coming in. I enjoyed it. I watched the jazz programs and I watched the Slot Canyon thing, and they were all wonderful. They were great programs. I have two quick questions. The first one is I was wondering if you would comment a little bit about the advent of organizations like Fox News, that some people say it presents biased information and what that might contribute or not contribute to the free media. The second question I have is, what does OPB do to support local authors? My wife has just had a book published recently, nonfiction. It's a good one about stroke survivors and stuff like that. She was trying to get on OPB to share the information and talk about it. It's called about 4 or 5 different places, at OPB to talk to them, and they keep saying, oh, we don't do that, but this does. No, we don't do that, but this does. And I was wondering if maybe you could tell me where there was one place you might be able to go to get some information about that.
Okay, I'll work backwards and start with that and then go back to Fox News. So we do have several different programs that will take that on, and so some of them are programs like Think Out Loud, which has its own editorial decision-making process, and might actually be a better fit for something like that than State of Wonder, where we also talk to authors, but those tend to be maybe more works of fiction, things like that, although they get into nonfiction as well. Once in a great while, we'll take on an author profile for an Art Beat segment or something like that. So I'd say probably the best way to start a conversation like that is actually to send it to our newsroom mailbox, because those folks are directing the messages every single day, and they can flag that and send it to the right group of people. It can be hard just to kind of call 5 or 6 different people, but that's the opbnews@opb.org is the email address. And the people who see that stuff coming in know what to do with that when they find it. So please do that, and we'll figure that part out. So Fox News is an interesting story. They're very clear about their mission and unapologetic about it, and I think that's fine, actually. I have a TV in my office, and I can see a bank of TVs through the door, so I can see a bank that has CNN, and we keep KGW on and something else, so I keep Fox News on in my office, because I find it interesting to see what they're talking about and how they're portraying it. They've been pretty forthright about being, I guess, if you will, a sort of a pro-conservative perspective on things. There's nothing illegal or immoral or unethical about that. That's what the First Amendment protects, right? You just have to remember that that's where it's coming from. And, I think they add something to the discussion as long as you remember what it is they're adding. This gets back to that, talking about sort of news literacy. My concern comes when people rely on that as their sole source of news. And I would say to people, don't rely on anybody as your sole source of news, not even OPB. You need to learn to triangulate stories in some way and sort of see what's being said here, what's being said there. You have to think about, this news organization, whether it's Fox News or NPR or OPB, do they have journalists out there on the ground reporting on these things? Are they reporting things secondhand? Or are they saying, well, so-and-so says this, let's talk about that? That's not journalism, that's punditry, and we need to make that distinction. For a while, MSNBC tried kind of the other end of that spectrum, and to some degree they have some of that coming from the left. That's fine. I think NBC is trying to turn that a little bit more into a straight cable news operation, but they haven't fully moved that way. It's just, it's incumbent on the consumer to understand where their news source is coming from, and then make some decisions about how they want to balance that information source in some way, and not just take that as the single sole source of information. On the whole, I think it's good to have different sources like that out there, because they will surface stories and points of view that other media outlets won't surface. And that could be important in getting past that kind of filter bubble and seeing how other people are thinking and seeing what other people are talking about, and then using your own intelligence to weigh, how much of that to believe and how much of it to dismiss. So I actually think it plays an important role in that regard.
Rob Solomon, forum member, and thanks, Morgan, for being here and your presentation. I want to follow up kind of on Bill's question and also your comment about trust. I understand what you're saying about it's incumbent upon the consumer to look at those different sources, etc. My concern is we used to trust our news sources, and now if I want to look at an objective source of news, I'm not sure where to go. I believe that most people, rightly or wrongly, have labeled just about every network as either left or right and biased. You guys have lots of great programs, and your news programs are great, and the reason why I think your news programs are great is because I agree with most of what they say. I don't particularly agree with Fox, and I don't watch them. Is there an objective source, and if there isn't an objective source, how can you develop trust?
That's a good question, and I think that the answer is probably no. There isn't an objective source anymore that there is an objective person. I mean, we're all human beings who have opinions and feelings and perspectives, and how we see the world is affected by our experiences. I think when it comes to being a media organization, what you want to try to do is have enough diversity in the experiences and the backgrounds and the knowledge of the people that are there to provide a sort of broad approach to things, so that you don't end up ending up in one particular place on an ideological spectrum, unless that's your intent, of course, in which case you want to have all people who work that way. This is actually, I've thought a lot about this, because I think there's something actually that news organizations need to do, and it actually goes back to Eric's question at the beginning. I think we need to find a way to tell people more about ourselves. You know, how do we work? Who are the people making the decisions? What's our process? And so that if you come across a story from somewhere, there's some place you can look and say, well, how does this outfit work? You know, is somebody editing this story, or you know, is this two guys in their pajamas in their basement putting news out? Which does happen, let me tell you. Or is this an organization that has a bunch of people and they have reporters and an editorial process? Once you know that, you can decide. I mean, you know, you may think two guys in their pajamas are a great source of information. That's your privilege as a citizen to think that. But the media doesn't do a very good job, on the whole, I would say, of being transparent about that, and it's not something we have had a lot of practice at. So I've been thinking about that as far as OPB is concerned. I'm not sure how we're going to take that on, but I think we do. I think, again, in some ways, newspapers did do us a public service, in the sense that you could look at the masthead, you could get a sense of their editorial structure and allocations by the way they were organized. But newspapers have shrunk tremendously. They don't have that level of editorial depth that they used to. And it's harder to see that overall. This is a discussion that's going on in journalism right at the moment about how to take this on. And part of that answer to rebuilding trust, I think, is going to be figuring out how to explain to people who we are and how we work, so that they can make that judgment about trust for themselves. Maybe when we figured it out, have me back and I'll tell you what the answer was, but I don't think we figured it out yet.
Thank you. Eric Levine, Forum member. Back in 1999, I had a chance to spend a month in Lincoln, Nebraska, studying at one house state legislature. A couple days I wasn't feeling well, so I simply sat in the living room, turned on channel 16, and watched gavel-to-gavel coverage of the legislature. I can't imagine that was a really great audience-building exercise, but it did provide a direct look of the people of Nebraska into that. Any possibility of that here? And I guess the other question would be, is there any way we can ever get rid of the festivals?
Those are two unrelated questions. So, I know our friends in Nebraska pretty well. They're an example of a public broadcaster that is a state agency. So one of the reasons they provide that coverage is the state pays them to do that, and provides the equipment and the channel space to do that. Oregon, in its wisdom, has never seen fit to do that for OPB, although we've had conversations with them about it. It's a fairly expensive undertaking, and it does require either channel space over the air or on cable that is hard to come by. That is still a scarce resource. So, I've thought about that over the years and wondered about the utility of it. I would say the thing that has changed our calculation on that the most is that these days they do stream the legislature online, so it's no longer necessary to have a broadcast transmitter or a cable channel to do it. It's only necessary to have a computer. And they're not everywhere, but they're getting close to everywhere, so that people who want to see the legislature in session or watch committees, things like that, the building is wired down there, all the hearing rooms, the floors, they have all the cameras and things. It's not broadcast quality, but it is online quality. So that material is accessible, and I struggle with where we'd really meet a larger need by putting that on the air, because there's not a big enough audience really to justify the expenditure that would benefit from that. Now again, it's a different situation for public broadcasters that are state agencies, where that's part of their state funding is to provide that service, and there are a handful of those around the country. Not too many really, but a few. Yeah, we're still going to do festivals for a while, so that's still working for us. So until the world changes on us, you're going to have to put up with those for a little bit longer. So thanks for your patience. Well, thank you all. I appreciated the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much, Mr. Holm. Excellent, and I really appreciate your candid responses to questions. I know I'm more trusting now. We are off for a long Christmas vacation, 3 weeks. I am looking forward to seeing everybody back here in 2017, the year that we will continue to grow with social media and great volunteers. Folks, January 9th, we'll get a chance to meet Sandra Fowler-Hill, the president of PCC Rock Creek Campus. Followed on the 16th, we'll have a Martin Luther King program. The incoming president of the Washington County Human Rights Organization will be here to speak. So we'll see you on January 9th. Thank you so much.